I like that. Give me a little bit more time to talk up here. Turn your Bibles, please, to 2 Samuel 18. 2 Samuel chapter 18 as we begin our study of God's Word, which is the second part to the spiritual growth process, which is worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. It is important to study His Word, but that's not all that we need to be doing. There's more to it. In the last couple of classes, today being the third, we have been talking about Absalom. And so Brian has been doing those classes on Absalom. And so we've learned about that David's son turned against him and tried to overthrow David's kingdom and take over. And came into Jerusalem. David had to get out of Jerusalem quickly. And one of the men that defected from David to Absalom was a very trusted advisor. Do you remember his long name? Ahithophel. Okay? And Ahithophel gave advice to Absalom that he followed, and that was to commit adultery with David's concubines in the sight of all Israel. And he does that, and Ahithophel gives him another piece of advice regarding attacking David. And what was his advice about attacking David? What was Ahithophel's advice?
Take a small force and
Yes.
attack David.
Yes. Go and do it now while David's on the run, and just go and get David, which actually was really good advice. But Absalom also wanted to know what this other advisor would say. Now, David had sent purposefully his other advisor named Hushai. And Hushai came in and pretended that he was defecting from David to Absalom and everything. And so Absalom asked, well, Hushai, what do you think I should do in terms of attacking David? He said, don't attack him now. That's not going to work. You need to wait and assemble a massive army and then go and attack David and all of his forces and just wipe them all out. And he said, that's a good idea. Actually, that was not good advice, but Absalom liked that advice, and he rejected the counsel of Ahithophel. And what did Ahithophel do when he saw that his advice was rejected? He killed himself. Brian's going to speak to us this morning about suicide, and so I wanted to make sure and just recap that whole story so that we can see the alignment between Bible class and the sermon on that. Hushai sent a message through his spy system to David that you need to go ahead and you need to get far away and for your safety. And so he told him to cross the Jordan. And so David crosses the Jordan to the east side of the Jordan, as chapter 17 and verse 22 talks about. And verse 26 tells us, in Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead, which is on the east of the Jordan. And so that's kind of where we are in the story as we begin this morning's lesson, as we talk about the defeat of Absalom and the rebellion of a man named Sheba. So we start in chapter 18. By this time, David had assembled a sizable army. So he had a little bit of time to do that. And he organized his men into three groups. And he had them under the oversight of three men. And do you happen to know who those were?
Joab.
All right, Joab was one of them. All right, and that was Joab's brother, Abishai. And then the third, a man by the name of Ittai, the Gittite. And David himself wanted to go into battle, but what did the people say? No, you're too valuable, you need to stay behind, and so he agrees to stay back. And we read in verse 5, the king charged Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king charged all the commanders concerning Absalom. It's understandable, isn't it? This is his son. I wouldn't want my son to be killed. Was this very practical, though? No, because if Absalom was allowed to live, could there really be peace in the kingdom? And so David's not being realistic here, but it is his son. So deal gently with Absalom so we can understand that from David's perspective. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, as verse 6 tells us, which is kind of confusing because which side of the Jordan was Ephraim located on? The west side. But we know that David and Absalom, and both of these armies, they're all over on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead. I pressed the wrong button, so if Keith can get that, that's good, or whoever's in the back. So I'm not sure the answer to that. Some think that there may have been an area in Gilead that was named after Ephraim. So I can't say for sure on that. But Absalom's men, once the battle began, Absalom's men were just outmatched. So what did they start doing? They started running. And who else ran? Their leader, their king. Start reading with me in verse 9. Now Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. What a helpless feeling. You're just hanging there, literally. You can't do anything. Here's a picture of some oaks, and this is in the Golan Heights. I'm not saying that's where the battle was, but it gives you an idea of this kind of a thick forest. Apparently the forest caused a lot of problems with the army of Absalom. And so, you can imagine you're trying to get away, and you're on a donkey, and you're trying to get away quickly, and these oak branches are hanging pretty low. That's going to be a problem. And so somehow he gets tangled up and caught in these branches. I'm not sure how. It doesn't say his hair got tangled in the branches, but we know he had long hair, but that could have been how. But it's, to be totally biblical, it says his head caught fast. So he's just stuck. He's just hanging there. And he's still alive. Verse 10, when a certain man saw it, he told Joab and said, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Then Joab said to the man who had told him, "Now behold, you saw him. Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." Well, Joab is not concerned about what David wants him to do. And we've seen this in Joab before when he killed Abner. Remember that? David didn't want him to do that. Joab is David's nephew. And he's very high in the kingdom. And he just apparently thinks he can kind of do what he wants. And in verse 12, the man said to Joab, "Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not put out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Protect for me the young man Absalom.'" Well, this attitude was the right attitude. That's the attitude we need to have toward our king. And when he gives a command, our attitude needs to be, I don't care how much it would benefit me to disobey this command. I don't care if I get the whole world. I'm not going to forfeit my soul, right? I'm going to obey the command of the king. So that's, a good example for us. Verse 13, he continues and he says, "Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof." In other words, you would have been happy to just stand by as I died for this. Then Joab said, "I will not waste time here with you." So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. Sounds like a bit of overkill to me. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around him and struck Absalom and killed him. So he's very dead. And I just think back to when we were first introduced to Absalom, and he's just this tall, super handsome guy, and over time he just develops all of this immense pride, and he thinks he can do anything, and he's an increasingly wicked man. And it makes me think of the passage in Proverbs 16:18. I like the King James on this one. "Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall." And that's a lesson for us. Now, even though David didn't want Absalom to die, and even though Joab disobeyed the orders of his king, the truth is Absalom deserved to die, and he needed to die. So I tend to think that God worked this out in his providence to see that it would occur this way. I don't know if he just happened to get caught in that tree. I think God in His providence was seeing to it that the man would be destroyed. But I don't have a verse to point to that, okay? So Joab then blew the trumpets to end the battle, blew the trumpet, and the people, what did they do with Absalom's body? They threw it in a pit, piled up rocks, a huge heap of rocks on the top of it, and Absalom's men fled to their homes in defeat. And in verse 18, now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself a pillar which is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he named the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Again, what a prideful man he was. I think of another proverb, Proverbs 27:2, let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. We need to think of that next time we consider making monuments for ourselves, as it were. Any thoughts, comments, or questions through the end of this section? David?
In verse 8 there it says, the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. What is that the oak that caught Absalom?
I suppose it was just a difficult forest to escape in, and apparently people died as a result. I don't have any more information. We have that one specific example of Absalom being caught in that tree, but I don't know anything more specific than that. That's a good question. Any other questions or comments? Miss Debbie, and then Miss Marilyn.
Well, it's just kind of boggling to me. I'm not sure I really understand the whole dynamic when Absalom, there was all those years. What was it, 7 or 11 years that there was all this resentment, because David didn't act when Tamar was raped, and then he went away for all those years, and then he came back, and David still wouldn't have anything to do with it. But for him to get so I'm jumping ahead, but for him to get so upset when he died, and that he didn't want him to die, do you think he really? The only thing we had was, that they, at one point, he finally came back and bowed down to him and he kissed him. Do you really think all that was resolved at that time?
No.
I mean, it was just so much.
Yeah.
So long of animosity.
It was, yeah. And David played a role in that. He loved his son, but he didn't express his love with the kind of hard love, the kind of tough love that needs to be expressed. And he was that way with other situations with his sons too. So he played a role in this, but he did deeply love his son emotionally. And David had a big heart of mercy and grace. We see that in many occasions, and this is one example of that. One more comment, then we'll have to move on. Miss Marilyn? Okay. What she said. Okay. Yeah. All right. So David mourns for his son now as we move forward, beginning with verse 19 of chapter 18. So Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, wanted to carry the news of the victory over Absalom's army and everything, but Joab did not want him to go and be the bearer of bad news. He wanted a different man to carry this bad news. We could speculate as to why, but I'm not going to speculate as to why. But either way, so he chose a different man, a Cushite runner, somebody that was not closely affiliated with David, to carry this bad news. It was good news, but it was bad news because Absalom was killed. And so when he left, Ahimaaz, he wasn't happy to just stand idle. Can you relate to that? You're like, well, I want to be involved. And so what did he ask? Let me run. And Joab says, you don't have a message to bring. You're not going to get a reward. Why do you want to run? I just want to run. Run! Okay? So he runs, and buddy, this guy is quick because that Cushite was already gone. And Ahimaaz, he apparently went a different path, but I'm not sure on that totally. But either way, he went faster, and he got there before the Cushite did at Mahanaim, which is where David was, and it's there on the east side of the Jordan, just north of the Jabbok River. And so David, he's just anxiously awaiting the news. And then the watchman saw this man coming and saw that there were two men coming, and the one in front, he said the running is like it is like Ahimaaz. And we all run differently. I kind of my feet are kind of pigeon-toed, and so I kind of run like a duck. These big, long, awkward strides. You can see me coming from a ways away and say, that's Adam running right there. We all kind of run differently, and so Ahimaaz had a certain run. You could just tell, that looks like Ahimaaz is running. And he was coming, and David thought, oh, it's Ahimaaz. He's a good man. He's got good news. And then there was another man behind him. Well, they're both bringing me good news. David's just trying to be optimistic. Have you ever been in that situation where, maybe there was bad news looming, but you were just doing your best to be optimistic? And I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And then once Ahimaaz showed up, David asked about Absalom. Is Absalom safe? Well, Ahimaaz had not actually been commissioned to bring a message, so he didn't have permission to really divulge anything specific. So he lied. And instead of saying Absalom was killed, he just kind of gives some very broad generalities, and he says, I didn't really know what, I saw a tumult, but I didn't really know what it was about. So David says, oh, okay, stand aside. So then the Cushite comes. And David again asks about Absalom, and he very tactfully says in verse 32, may all the enemies of my Lord the king be as that young man is. In other words, dead. And, just as a side note, I think there's a lesson we could apply here. We're running. Are we bringing a message? Some people are running religiously. They're running, but they're not really bringing a message. They're not bringing the truth. And make sure that we are running with a message. In verse 33 of chapter 18, the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. And your heart just breaks for David here. It's very sad. I made the point last Sunday in my lesson about Absalom that, here David, he's grieved deeply over his son. And our Father, He's grieved whenever we turn our backs on Him and we die spiritually. He's very grieved. He is crushed in that situation. And the difference is David wanted to die for his son, but he couldn't do that. But God didn't just want to die for us. He gave His Son to die for us. So there's so much power in this section. Any thoughts or questions or comments before we move to the next section? Vanessa?
I think with David, he's such an example of how we should own up to our mistakes and as parents to our children say, I messed up.
Yeah.
He loved Absalom.
Yeah.
He was mad that Absalom did what he did and that Absalom took on that responsibility of Tamar. But he also felt guilty that he didn't step up for Tamar.
Sure.
And I think he felt guilty about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And instead of saying to Absalom, I was wrong to not stand up for Tamar. I was wrong to not have done those things. But I love all my children. And it's hard for me. And to talk that out a little bit to an adult. I mean, he's an adult. They're adults.
Yeah.
And this is where it's led to. And now he's lost a lot of children along the way. And his kingdom. Thousands and thousands of people have died because of his mistakes.
Yeah. David made mistakes. He made mistakes with his kids. But do we all make mistakes with our kids? Isn't raising kids kind of just a series of a whole bunch of mistakes, one on top of the next? Right, JC? I mean, that's just the way it is, and we just try to do better. Unfortunately, David kept this behavior up of not dealing with his sons. And if you do that with your kids and you don't deal with them and you allow that behavior to go on not dealt with and not corrected, then it can result in something very tragic, very bad, very sad. So that can be a lesson for us. But yes, he could have and should have used the opportunity to talk to Absalom and really talk these things out, make it right. Let's get Leon and then Brenda.
I've just got a small question.
Yes, sir.
And my small question is, who did David love?
You tell me. Yeah,
Who did David love?
right. And I think the point you're making is, did he love God or did he love his son? Is that what you're saying?
No.
Oh, okay.
Who did David love? Because when David loved God, had faith in God.
Right,
In God, he loved his son.
right.
God is the one that hands down all those things that we need.
Amen. Good point. Good point. All right.
Woo!
All right, Miss Brenda, or Dave, sorry.
All this is a consequence. It goes all the way back to David's sin with Sheba, and you just see the fallout from that. Just go from one
Yes.
son to the next son to the
Yes.
next to the next, and the consequences for him as a leader, as the king, making mistakes with his children were substantial.
Yeah,
You know, we all make mistakes with our children, yes, but his responsibility and what position God had given
right.
him,
Amen.
the consequences cost thousands of lives
Yeah,
and ruined
yeah,
thousands of lives.
yeah. And David basically became paralyzed as a parent because I think of what he had done. And it was like, well, I did that and I can't really come down hard on my sons for what they're doing. But we can't let that happen to us as Christians and as parents. Like, yes, you made those mistakes, but that doesn't mean to just ignore the mistakes your children are making in the same fashion. You repented of that, and you dealt with that, and you don't want to see the same thing happen to your kids that happened to you. So don't ignore it. Don't be passive. Be active about that. One more comment, Brian?
I think another tragedy in this is that if Absalom would have just waited on the Lord, trusted in Him, God would have had good things in store for him.
Amen.
Potentially getting the kingdom after David.
That's
He'd
right.
been next in line for the throne. But
Yeah.
he kind of treats David like the prodigal son. He says, I want the inheritance now.
Yep.
You're dead to me.
Yep,
And then he gets killed in a tree and thrown in a ditch.
that's right.
It's so sad.
Pride comes before a fall, and lack of patience, lack of faith in God, trusting in oneself. That's right. It all leads to ruin, and the ruin is ultimately eternally, but there are also earthly consequences to those kinds of decisions. And we learn that in the Old Testament over and over. So going into chapter 19, Joab reproves David. Joab heard that the king was weeping over Absalom, and the whole army heard about it. And so they didn't come back to Jerusalem with joy and triumph over their victory. They came in like they were going into a funeral or something. And Joab just comes to David and just rebukes him. And he basically says, you've just put the soldiers to shame. After they saved you and they saved your family, you've made it clear that the people in your army mean nothing to you. You'd be happier if Absalom were alive and we were all dead. You'd better go talk to the people before they all leave you. That's a pretty bold way to talk to the king. Frankly, maybe David needed somebody to be blunt with him. I'm sure that Joab could have done this with more compassion. But I do think there's some truth in what Joab is saying here. I think David really needed to hear this. And the lesson, I think, for us is sometimes we focus so completely on our own problems and our own griefs that we're blind to how we're affecting others. And we're blind to the needs of others. And so we need to open our eyes. And sometimes we need somebody to come point it out. It is ironic, however, that Joab was the one that caused this grief by killing Absalom against the king's orders. And yet he's the one that has the audacity to brazenly rebuke the king. So that's troubling to me. But David, nevertheless, meekly accepted the rebuke. And we just see the Spirit in David time and time again. Even though he's the king, he readily accepts rebuke. Do we? It takes humility. It takes humility. So he sat in the gate, and when the people saw him there, they gathered around, and soon the army was all gathered. And so what David had to do was set aside his incredible grief to rejoice with those who rejoice. And again, I mean, there's so much application we don't always want to rejoice with those who rejoice. Because maybe we're not in such a happy time of our life. But, Romans 12 tells us, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. So it takes selflessness. Be a big person and just set aside your griefs to rejoice with this person or these people who are rejoicing. And so David has to do that in a big way here. Any thoughts or questions here before we move forward? Jason? Talk real loud.
I immediately thought of Ecclesiastes 3, where we go through the whole list of there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to weep, a time to die. And the rebuke can be taken that way. Is David, there will be a time for you to grieve.
Right.
Absalom.
Good point. That's a good passage to refer to.
But
Yeah.
this is not the time.
This is not the time.
And that's it's a hard thing.
Sure.
I mean, I don't have children, but if I lost a child, I may not care what anything else that's going on.
Sure,
And I think
sure.
David was suffering from some guilt because I think David knew, as Brother Dave pointed out, sorry, 2 days there, that David knew that this all went back to his own sin.
Right.
Not just all the way back to Sheba, but then failing to be a parent, failing to hold him accountable, being paralyzed as a parent. And so it wasn't just his grieving for Absalom, it was, I think, guilt and all of that. And
Sure.
It became self-indulgent.
Sure. Good point.
And I think that's where Ecclesiastes is that big picture. That's very hard, but the word perspective comes to mind.
Yeah.
Look, I understand.
Right.
And like you said, he could have been a little more compassionate. I understand.
Right. Sure. But he was right. The substance of his statement was right. So, yeah. Very good. Great reference, Ecclesiastes 3. I love that. Good point. As we move forward, David returns to his kingdom. So the battle of Absalom might have been over, but that didn't mean the kingdom was just all at peace now and everything was just fine and dandy. There was still a lot of turmoil, and the people hesitated to bring David back as king, and so they argued among themselves about how to handle this situation. And David heard about these rumors, and so he sent a message to the 2 priests who we keep referring to. And who were they? Do you remember? It's a Z and an A. Zadok and Abiathar. Okay? Zadok and Abiathar. And he gives them instructions to ask the men of Judah why they weren't the first to bring King David back. Why would that message need to be communicated to Judah? That's his tribe, right? That's David's tribe. They should have been the first, and they were like the last to do anything about this. And so he also gave a message. He told Zadok and Abiathar to inform Amasa that everything's going to be okay. He has nothing to fear. Who was Amasa? That's right. He had been the commander of Absalom's army. So you have nothing to fear. You're flesh and blood. He actually was a nephew as well. Okay? He had a different mother than Joab and Abishai and the other one that was already killed by this point. But anyway, he was going to bring him in and make him the new captain in place of whom? Joab. In place of Joab. Ooh, well, we can already tell something bad's going to happen there, right? So David won the hearts of the men of Judah, and they asked him to return to them. And David and the company that was with him set out to cross the Jordan River in victory. I assume traveling from Mahanaim down to Gilgal, because that's where they were going to cross. And the men of Judah assembled in Gilgal, waiting to welcome their king home. And there was the man who had cursed David and threw rocks at him when he was fleeing from Jerusalem. He was there. What was his name? Shimei. You think Goliath was a trash talker. Shimei, it was the worst trash talker in all of Scripture. Well, he had come. He was there, and 1,000 men of Judah were with 1,000 men of Benjamin. Were there with the men of Judah. Also, Ziba was there with his 15 sons and 20 servants. Ziba had been made the servant of the son of Jonathan, whose name was Mephibosheth. So he was there, and David and his household crossed the Jordan on a boat, which the men of Judah had provided. But before he crossed, when they had gotten the boat over to his side, on the east side of the Jordan, the first person that ran to greet him was whom? That trash talker. Shimei. And fell on his face, just apologizing to David for what he had done. And I just have to question, was he apologizing because he was deeply sorry for saying what he said? Or was he really doing this because he just didn't want the king to punish him? I'm not sure. I just lean towards the second one because he just seems to go where the power is. And we just need to ask ourselves when we apologize, why we're apologizing. When we're apologizing to people and when we're apologizing to God. What is our motive? Because that's key. That is very important. Are we just doing it to kind of save our skin, or are we doing it because we're grieved over what we've done because it was wrong? But I can't judge his heart. That's where I lean on that. And so, of course, Abishai, he's always ready to kill people, isn't he? Remember when Shimei had been cursing David, Abishai had wanted to cut his head off. And so here he's like, well, shouldn't he die? Shouldn't I go kill him? And David rebuked him, and he said, no, this is not the day that we need to kill somebody. And he swore to Shimei that he would not die. But this comes back up later. David does not forget the incident of Shimei's trash talking. In verses 24 through 30, we have Mephibosheth coming. Now, Mephibosheth was crippled. And he was the son of Jonathan that David has shown incredible kindness to. And he came to set the record straight. He came, first of all, to say, I'm so glad you're back. He hadn't even been taking care of himself because David had been gone, and he was upset and stressed out about that. And he said, listen, my master, Sheba, he slandered me. And if you remember back in... Let's see if I can find where I'm at. Well, earlier anyway, I think it was chapter 16. Sheba had said to David that Mephibosheth stayed behind when you fled Jerusalem. He didn't come, and because he's just excited that his father's kingdom is being restored back to him. Like he's against you now, when David had shown all that kindness to him. Well, I don't think that was true at all. And Mephibosheth here is setting that record straight. And David says, well, I tell you what, I'll just split. You take half the property, he takes half of it. And so I don't know if David really knows who to believe here, but he does show some mercy towards him. And what does Mephibosheth say? Let him have it all. I'm just glad you're back. And that again shows his heart. And when we look at the difference, the contrast between the way that Sheba had approached David back in chapter 16, I think Sheba's intent was just to get out from under Mephibosheth and get all of his stuff. But Mephibosheth, his desire is not like some personal gain at all. It is just, I just want to set the record straight and make sure you know that I love you. And so he does that. But yet, I think there's a lesson here that Sheba's slander threatened to destroy David's affection for Mephibosheth. And I think the fact that David doesn't just fully restore back to Mephibosheth everything may be indicative of the fact that perhaps there was something lost situation because maybe David didn't know who to believe. That's one of the effects of slander and gossip. It tends to taint a person's attitude toward that person you're talking about. And if you're telling lies, that person might believe that and kind of hold a grudge against that individual from that point on because you slandered. It's very serious. It's a serious sin. And in Proverbs we read, in Proverbs 16:28, help me in the back if you can, it says, a perverse man spreads strife and a slanderer separates intimate friends. Apparently my thumbs are too goofy to press these buttons the right way. There we have it. Well, I'm going to kind of skip over talking about Barzillai. His little story isn't all that helpful to the plot. So we'll move forward now and talk in the last little while of our class here about the rebellion of Sheba. But before we do that, does anybody have any thoughts or questions first? Okay. Yes?
Just when you were talking about Shimei and his apology and whether or not he was sincere, regardless, though, we've talked before, and you've said this many times from the pulpit about love believes all things.
Yeah.
And so I think it's not that David forgot, because God doesn't tell us to be foolish and accept words out of somebody's mouth when we know them to be untrue.
Right.
But his conduct was such that he was giving Shimei the benefit of whatever
Okay.
he had.
Okay. Good point.
And again, I think that kind of exemplifies that principle
Yeah.
of believing all things. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying we need to be stupid when we know somebody is lying to us.
Right. Right.
But he gave him the benefit of whatever doubts he had,
Sure.
at least in terms of immediate consequences to his life.
So, there's a balance, isn't it, between being, as Jesus said, wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. And David does show mercy towards him. And I like your point. He gives him the benefit of the doubt. And when Jesus teaches in Matthew 18 that if your brother sins against you 7 times, if he lies against you or something like that, he just says if he sins against you 7 times in the same day, what do you need to do? Now, don't you think after the 2nd or 3rd time you'd start saying, I'm really doubting your motives here? I'm really doubting your heart? It's not our place to question that. If somebody's coming to us asking for forgiveness, and so David does give Ziba the benefit of the doubt. I think that's a great point. Well, let's turn our attention to Sheba now. So the men of Israel came to meet the company and complained against the men of Judah for leaving them out of bringing David across the Jordan. And the two groups just kind of went back and forth in this sort of non-intellectual discussion. It just got heated. And the men of Judah did have a good point, but they kind of won out the argument because they were more fierce than the men of Israel. And sadly, that's kind of how arguments become. It's just the one who is the fiercer that wins out. But in chapter 20, in verses 1 and 2, it says, Now a worthless fellow happened to be there whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew the trumpet and said, We have no portion in David, nor do we have inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So all the men of Israel withdrew from following David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah remained steadfast to their king from the Jordan even to Jerusalem. It's sad. Just recently, this rebellion of Absalom has been sort of calmed and done away with. Not totally, even though David had kind of unified the nation a little bit. Before David is even back to Jerusalem, there's already another rebellion. And this division. Remember Nathan's prophecy that the sword will never depart from David's house. So when David arrived in Jerusalem, the first thing he did was to put the 10 concubines whom Absalom had slept with in the sight of all Israel. He put them kind of in seclusion away from the other wives and concubines. He no longer regarded them as his concubines. They were treated as widows. And then he turned his attention to the rebellion of Sheba. And he told his new commander, and what was his name again? A lot of names to keep up with in this particular lesson. Amasa. To gather the men of Judah within 3 days, because he needed to hurry and stamp out this rebellion. Well, Amasa went to do that, but he didn't make it back within the 3 days. So David told Abishai to go after Sheba before he reached a fortified city. Notice he didn't tell Joab. Joab was just another soldier, apparently. Well, the army departed under the command of Abishai, and when they came to Gibeon, to the great stone in Gibeon, Amasa was there. And so Joab sees Amasa, who has taken his place as commander. He's going to do the same thing he did to Abner. He had a dagger on his hip, and he went to him as if to greet him and kind of let the dagger fall on the ground. Oh, I dropped my dagger. Picked his dagger up. So he's standing here with a dagger in his hand, and he's going to go and kiss Amasa. So he goes in to kiss him, grabs his beard, and sticks him. And he falls to the ground. And so Amasa is lying there dying, and the army just sees Amasa laying there, and they're just kind of horrified. And so one of Joab's men moves the body out of the road and covers it up and says, "Let's follow Joab and David." And so the people do, and they go to pursue Sheba. Sheba had fled to a city called Abel of Beth Maacah, or Abel Beth Maacah. And as Joab traveled north to go up there, he gathered more men for his army, so that by the time he got there, he had enough men to besiege the city. And that picture you see, that mound right there, is the ancient site of Abel Beth Maacah. So they surrounded that city. It would be almost like surrounding a neighborhood. So we're not talking about a big old city. And started to besiege try to tear the walls down and everything of an Israelite city. And there was this wise woman who got Joab's attention and said, "Now, why are you consuming," or how does it read it? "Why are you swallowing up Jehovah's inheritance?" And he said, "Oh, no, I'm just after Sheba." And she said, "Well, if you'll just hold on a minute, we'll throw Sheba's head over the wall." So Joab, okay. And she tells the people what to do, and she's just this wise woman. And they cut off his head, throw it over the wall, it's all over. You think there's a lesson to learn from that wise woman? I think one of the lessons we can learn from her, not that we need to cut people's heads off, but we can resolve conflict. Instead of just fighting, we can solve it more wisely and more effectively by genuinely seeking to understand why the other person is upset. This applies in all relationships. Usually, when somebody's upset, they're not upset over the thing that they're talking about. There's something deeper. And so try to understand by talking rationally and get to the heart of the problem. And then usually, if you can get to that core issue, it's a lot easier now to resolve the conflict than dealing with all these other external things, and all we end up doing is just fighting it against one another. It's a good lesson for all of us. The kingdom of David at this point was fully restored, and things continued as they had been with the same people in positions of authority, including Joab as the commander of the army. And David was not happy about that. And think about the fact that when Joab killed Amasa, that was his cousin. It was his first cousin. And so it was just brutal. Does anybody have any? We have a couple of minutes, so I shouldn't put that up yet. But does anybody have any thoughts or questions?
To see all this playing out, the infighting and debating and the killing and all this, when it's already been decided that David is the king. David was God's anointed before Absalom, rebelled.
Sure.
Rebellion, and he's still the king now, as far as God's concerned. But nobody has appealed to God to say, "Who is your king?"
Good point. There should have been no question. Do we submit to David? Well, of course. He's the Lord's anointed. Absalom should have never been followed by anybody, just based on that fact alone. That's a really good point. And to make a spiritual parallel, our king is the Messiah. If somebody shows up and says they're the Messiah and there's some other Messiah out there, don't follow them. We know who the real Messiah is, our King, the King of Kings, the Lord Jesus Christ. Any other thoughts or questions? Tom?
I find it ironic that at the beginning of 20, it's Benjamin. This is this is a long stretch, but back in Genesis 44, it is Judah who stands in place of Benjamin before Joseph when he says he's going to be my slave, and Judah says, no, take me instead. Very long stretch, but Jesus, Judah, Benjamin, rebellion. Here we have Benjamin rebelling against Judah, as it were, or line of.
That's deep. That is deep.
It's a long stretch, but
There's a possible connection there.
ironic, yeah.
There's a possible connection there. Yeah, I like that thought. That's good. All right, I think we're pretty much out of time. Please read through the beginning of page 101 for Wednesday night. Thanks.